So how does this content end up on our screen? Well, I mentioned in the previous lecture that it would be that index.html file in the src folder that would in the end be loaded by the browser when visitors visit our website. But if you take a closer look at that file, you will see that it's almost empty. The body element there only contains one HTML element, this strange app root element here, which is not a standard HTML element. The browser on its own indeed would not understand this element. And that's now where Angular comes in. Because as I mentioned, it's actually the code in this main.ts file that will be executed when your website loads up. Now in the index.html file, you don't find any imports of that main.ts file. Indeed, there are no script tags at all in there. But if you visit the loaded website and you view its page source, you will actually see that in there are script imports. And those are injected into this file automatically by the Angular CLI when you build and run your application. So for example, by running ngserve, which we did by running npm start. So that's how the scripts end up in there, and that's how this code in main.ts gets executed, after being compiled to JavaScript code, which is also done by the CLI. That's why in that source code we actually find .js files being imported here, because TypeScript wouldn't run in the browser. So it's this compiled code that's being executed. And this code does one important thing. It executes a function provided by the Angular package, the Bootstrap application function, and this function, in the end, wants an Angular component. And as I mentioned in the first section, one of the core concepts of Angular is that you will be building components. So this function wants such a component, and it in the end then takes this component and looks for this component in that index.html file and tries to replace the tag, the element tag of your custom component, with the markup you defined for your custom component. Now here in this case, it's actually this app component imported from this path here that's being passed to Bootstrap application. And if we follow that path, we end up in this app folder, and there the app component.ts file. Now the file extension is actually missing here because for .ts files you should omit them. So instead of importing something from a .ts file, you import it from just the file name without the extension. But it is this app.component.ts file from which we're importing something, and we are importing something called app component. And if we take a look at this app.component.ts file, we see that this is this class. This class is called app component. So it's that thing we're importing and passing to this Bootstrap application function here. And this class in Angular creates such a component, such a custom HTML element. Now it does that because it's not just a class here. Instead, we also have this strange add component thing above it. And that's a so-called decorator, which is a TypeScript feature that in the end adds some metadata to that thing it's attached to, so to this class here. And Angular uses decorators like this component decorator to add extra metadata to certain things, like to this class here. And as you can see, this component decorator is actually coming from the Angular framework. We're importing it from the core package that's part of the Angular framework. And it's then this decorator that converts this standard class into such an Angular component that's treated as a component, so as a custom HTML element by Angular, you could say. Now this component thing here, this component decorator, then receives an object with some configuration for this component. And I'll get back to some of these options later, but one crucial setting you can see here is this selector property. Because this in the end tells Angular for which elements it should look in the HTML code so that those elements can be replaced by this component and its markup. And the markup of this component is stored in the so-called template of that component. And Every Angular component has such a template, which typically is stored in an external file to which the path is provided with help of this template URL property. So here it's this app component HTML file that contains the markup for this component, for this custom HTML element. So now because of this selector, we know that we're looking for an element called app-root, so with a tag of app-root, and that it's this markup that should be rendered in its place. We also have some styles set up, also stored in an external file, and these will be styles that only apply to the markup of this component, so they can't clash with any other styles of other components, which is pretty convenient. And we got some other settings which we can ignore for now. But it's because of this setup and because of this selector here, most importantly, that this app-root element in the index.html file is replaced by the markup stored in this app component HTML file. And that is this title, this subtitle, and this image here. And that indeed is what we're seeing on the screen. And that's how Angular is taking over and how such an Angular component ends up on the screen.